Welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight we're going to talk about those interesting quirks of language called idioms. Not idiots, idioms. We'll learn what idioms are and why they're interesting. We'll see examples of idioms in Oklahoma Indian languages, although I'm going to take most of my examples this time from English and from other languages from around the world. I'll kind of explain why later that I don't have a whole lot of examples from Oklahoma Indian languages, but we will have a few. And finally, we'll look at how to recognize and single out idioms in a language and how they may be useful. Learning idioms is useful for language learning purposes in your language classroom. Let's start with a definition. Now, when I studied linguistics, I got some definitions of idioms, but I thought I'd just look up in an everyday dictionary, a couple of everyday dictionaries, and see how well that meaning matched that they gave there, just for the lay person. And actually, it matches up pretty well. In Webster's Collegiate Dictionary of a few years back, it says one of the meanings it gives for idioms is an expression in the usage of a language, ... particular to itself, either in grammatical construction or in having a meaning which cannot be derived as a whole from the combined meanings of the words. And then it goes on to say it could also mean any structure peculiar to a particular language. The Concise Oxford Dictionary says, a group of words established by usage and having a meaning not deducible from those of the individual words. So there's what these two definitions have in common is pretty much the way I think of an idiom. They are expressions which may have a literal meaning, but when they are used as idioms, they have what you could call an idiomatic meaning. That is something that you just have to know because you know the language so well that you know what a particular expression means. Now, I don't think I helped much with that definition. Let me give one example to start off to make that a little more clear. Kick the bucket is an example that's often quoted from English. You can kick a bucket and say, okay, I kicked the bucket. That's not an idiom. That's a literal meaning that you're using there. But you could use that same phrase idiomatically when you say, I feel like I'm going to kick the bucket any minute, meaning I think I'm going to die any minute. I feel so bad. So kick the bucket meaning die. That's an example of an idiom. And it's an idiom because the meaning die, no part of that meaning is contained in kick or bucket. In other words, when you say you're going to kick the bucket, in the idiomatic sense, meaning you're going to die, you're not saying anything about kicking or buckets, and yet the words are there, kicking and bucket, but they're used in a very special way that does not kind of add up. If you take the meaning of each word and add it up, you don't get the meaning of the phrase. The meaning of the phrase is something entirely different, and it's not always easy to see how on earth this expression came to mean what it means idiomatically. They're just something that you kind of have to memorize. If you grow up with the language, you know a lot of them. Every language has idioms, and English sure has a lot. Now, they're not the same as ordinary phrases. Like when you use kick the bucket in the ordinary sense, you could rephrase it using synonyms. You could say, I hit the bucket with my foot, or I kicked the pail, and it would mean the same thing. But when you're talking about kick the bucket in the sense of die, you make those substitutions, then you lose the idiom. So it's a kind of frozen expression of a certain combination of words. I think you can sometimes call a single word an idiom, but typically people think of it as a phrase, two or more words. And the meaning of each word added together does not give you the meaning of the phrase. The meaning of the phrase is something perhaps altogether different and unexpected. So they don't always compute, this word plus that word equals the meaning of the whole. Now there is a similarity, and as I was thinking about how to present this topic, I started getting myself a little confused as to the similarity between idioms and metaphors. Metaphor is a term that you learn in English class or literature class, and it's a kind of imaged, figurative use of language where you're making a comparison. For instance, if you said, you're the light of my life, you mean that also in a non-literal sense. You're comparing the person to a light because they shed a nice glow or they make you feel good or warm or happy or something like that. And so you can maybe call that an idiom, but I think that's more of just a metaphor, especially because there's a series of expressions that all have the same idea of light being something positive, perhaps happy and warm and comfortable. So you can say, you're the light of my life, or you light up my life, or let's shed some light on that, or I have a lighter feeling when I wear these clothes. All these references to light have something in common, which is kind of a common metaphor that we use in English in a number of different expressions. An idiom is more of a unique thing that we all know, but it doesn't have many different variations usually. It's just a set phrase that we memorize means a certain thing. They're often very colorful, as in kick the bucket. I don't know why it means die, but it gives a kind of colorful and interesting image. Another thing is that a metaphor actually could be created by an individual on the spot. You just come up with saying, oh, let's see, you are the dressing on my turkey sandwich, or something. You know, you could just come up with something that has personal meaning to you and use it in a metaphorical way. But an idiom is something that a community of speakers have agreed on. They agree that it has its certain meaning, and then speakers of the language use it in that agreed upon way. So it's a little bit of a gray area between idioms and metaphor. Sometimes it's a little hard to say which is which. For instance, we have in English the expression, she's not playing with a full deck. So if someone's not playing with a full deck, we mean they're stupid or they're not paying attention. You know, they're doing stupid things. The image that it calls forth is someone playing a card game and they're at a disadvantage because they don't have all the cards. So of course, how can they win? I guess is what's behind that. But now, is that a metaphor? It certainly is making a kind of parallel in this kind of image. It doesn't fit into any general metaphor of cards or anything, I don't think. But is it an idiom that we all agree on this saying? I don't know. There's a whole series of these. You know, the lights are on, but nobody's home. Her elevator doesn't go to the top, and there's a whole series of these kind of expressions. I'm not quite sure if you'd call those metaphors or idioms, but they're very idiomatic in being something that only fluent speakers really use this kind of expression frequently. I'll try to stick to a little bit more clear examples in this. So let's start by looking at some more English examples, because there's lots of great ones in English. Things that you might not think of as being idioms until you try to break it down and say, what does each word mean and what does the whole thing mean? It really doesn't add up. It's a unique assignment of meaning to a phrase. Okay, I've written them all in my margin here as I kept thinking of more and more examples or finding them in books I looked at. I might not go through all of these, but let's go through a few. One is, and this is supposedly, or it was or is, characteristic of urban black English in the United States, when you say you're bad, but it doesn't mean that you're bad literally. It means you're terrific, actually, or it means you're really somebody to deal with, or something like that. I think this has become kind of borrowed from that dialect to the general usage, so more people now say you're bad than used to in that sense. But when you say you're bad and you don't mean bad in the sense of not good, then you're using an idiomatic expression there. Kick the bucket, we already mentioned, and there's another idiom for dying, which is to croak. What does croak mean literally? This is a one-word idiom, I think. To croak is to make your call, to sound your call if you're a frog. That's the main meaning I can think of for croak, literal meaning. But we use croak in this idiomatic sense also, meaning to kick the bucket, to die. Lots of much more common things than that, even though. To see the light. Oh, I see the light. There's another light image, but I think we could call this one an idiom because it doesn't have much to do with vision or with light. It has to do with understanding. The expression, it's over my head. It doesn't have to do with the actual elevation or height of something or my head or anything physical, really. It's talking about difficulty. It's too difficult for me. So that's an idiomatic phrase. To stretch the truth. Sort of metaphorical, sort of idiomatic. To save face. When you save face, you're not really doing anything to your face, and maybe you are saving something, but it's a non-literal meaning of face there for sure. To save face when you save your reputation or maintain your dignity or avoid being humiliated, that sort of thing. That's idiomatic, I think. Let's see, to get to first base with someone. He kept giving her flowers and candy every day, but never got to first base. We're not talking about baseball. To bury the hatchet might not have anything to do with the ground or with weaponry. It just means to make peace in a general sense. There is some relationship between the meaning of hatchet being an instrument of war and making peace. But it's indirect enough that I think we'd call that an idiom. Here's a classic English idiom, to pull the wool over someone's eyes. It has nothing to do with eyes and wool. It has to do with fooling someone. Let's see. Oh, I couldn't read this one for a second. This is one I got from a text where one of the authors was British. The expression is, they ran off hell for leather. I think maybe in American English you say hell bent for leather. But anyway, it just sort of means running off with a great energy and craziness and chaos, I guess, something along those lines. Doesn't have much to do with hell, literally, or with leather at all that I can see, but there's probably some metaphor behind that that's kind of been forgotten, so that now it's just strictly an idiomatic phrase. Pulling someone's leg is one that's, very commonly used, and we don't even think about what we're saying sometimes when we say that, but of course we don't mean it literally. We mean it as an idiom. When you are teasing someone, you pull their leg. Sell someone down the river. I'm told that the history of that expression has to do with slavery in the southern part of the United States, and I think the Mississippi River is the one being referred to. But mostly when we say that, we just think, oh, it's one of those expressions. It's just an idiom. It's the way we talk about, I guess, betraying someone, loosely speaking. Haul someone over the coals is another good idiom. Put your foot in your mouth. It really doesn't involve taking off your shoes or anything. It's something that you do in a non-literal way. When you make a certain kind of mistake, you might say you put your foot in your mouth. So that's an idiom. Cut it out, very common expression. I just think, well, to cut out means to quit. But there is a kind of literal meaning if you take that word by word, and then there's the general meaning of cut it out, which is to quit something, stop doing it. So I think that's an idiom. To bite your tongue, there's a literal meaning possible with that phrase, or you can think of it as the idiom where you just prevent yourself from saying something, you hold back on something that you could say but didn't. Give someone a piece of your mind is another good one. Let's hope we don't mean that literally. And here's one of a little more modern coinage, I think, when you say, she's all that. Well, all what? What are we talking about? It's just a saying. It's just one of those things. You hear the phrase as a whole, and you know what someone means. She thinks she's all that is another one a variation on that, where someone's kind of stuck up. They think they're just the top of what you can be. Now, of course, as I said before, every language has idioms. I gave you a long list from English because, of course, I'm most familiar with those. And a lot of these are things that people who are mere students of a language won't know. They might know a lot of vocabulary. They may be able to speak pretty fluently as long as they stay literal in their meaning. But you can throw them really quickly by just using a common idiom that all the native speakers of the language know and take for granted. But a language learner, no matter how advanced, will be fooled by at least some of these, I think, in most cases, because they're just so idiomatic. They depend on being part of the culture, hearing these expressions and becoming used to them. If you're a second language speaker of this language, your tendency is going to be to try to interpret it literally, and you won't be able to make head nor tail of it, to bring up another idiom. Okay, Spanish, I got one I wanted to cite from Spanish, estirar el petate. I learned this one in Mexico. It literally means to stretch out your sleeping mat. And it's an expression that means to die, or croak, or kick the bucket, so to speak. And I think the image I always got from this is someone's lying down there, they're really ill, and then suddenly, and that would stretch out your sleeping mat, I suppose. But obviously it doesn't really mean that. Literally, you can stretch out your sleeping mat even if you're sitting in a chair when you die, I think, because it's become just an idiom. I've got a few here from French. Again, these are phrases where you cannot predict the meaning of the whole phrase by adding up the meaning of each word. It's just a special conventional thing that French speakers know. And good students of French will know at least some of these. Here's one. This is called thumbing your nose in English. I don't think that's really an idiom. We're using thumb as a verb instead of a noun, but I wouldn't go so far as to call that an idiom. You can sort of partially guess what that would be from the words themselves. But in French, it's called faire un pied de nez, to make a foot of your nose. I don't know where that comes from, unless this somehow looks like a foot. I don't know, but or this. But anyway, that's the expression in French, and you could never guess it by guessing the meaning of each word. You just have to know that expression, that idiom, and learn it specifically if you want to understand the phrase. Here's another one. Vous pouvez vous mettre la ceinture. That means something like, the translation, I was reading this in a French translation, but the translation they gave was an English idiom, you've had it. In other words, the idea is you're in trouble. The literal meaning of vous pouvez vous mettre la ceinture is you can put the belt around yourself. So I don't know quite how that adds up to you've had it, but it's an idiom that means approximately that. Here's another one that I'm not too fond of. I don't know. I know some French, and this one I hadn't known. I just found it in a book today. It sounds a little disgusting to me. You say ça lui pend au nez. It's supposed to mean he's got it coming to him, which I guess is an idiom too in English. Ça lui pend au nez literally means it's hanging on his nose. So I don't know why people came up with this expression. But it's an idiom of French. If you don't speak French, you'll never guess it. But if you speak French well enough, you'll know things like these idioms. And one more from French. Je vous confie la maison. Literally, I'm entrusting you with the house. And they say the English equivalent, in this text I was consulting, they said the English equivalent is hold down the fort, or hold down the fort for me. This is like if you're in a business or something and you're handing over supervision of something to someone else while you have to leave the office. Je vous confie la maison. I'm entrusting the house to you. So those are a few from French. Now here's one from ASL. I have to put my paper down to do this one because it involves two hands. ASL is American Sign Language, which is the specific name of the gestural language that most deaf people in the United States use. It's different from sign languages of other countries, and it's different from Indian Sign Language and other gestural systems. It's its own thing, American Sign Language. There's an expression in ASL, American Sign Language, that means something like, that went right by me, I think would be the best equivalent. And you go something like, like this. And so I guess this is the thing that's going by you, and you send it right past your head, and you give a little bewildered look, like, wow. You know, I think there's another expression in English that this reminds me of a little bit, which is that it went right over my head. It has that kind of image, although we don't necessarily make the gesture when we speak English. But it went right past me in ASL is a very common idiom. You see people using it all the time when something was just too much for them to comprehend and they were overwhelmed by the complicatedness of it. Now, Hiroko Inahama, who's operating cameras for us tonight, was kind enough to give me some examples from Japanese. And Hiroko, I better not try to pronounce these, but I'll give the literal meaning and then the idiomatic meaning, because I don't know from Japanese. I learned a few expressions in judo, and that's about it. So, hajime. The first one, I had read an article recently about this actually, and I couldn't find it when I was preparing for the show today, but apparently there are a number of expressions in Japanese that refer to cats. This first one is an example of that. It says literally, I need a cat's hands. That's the literal meaning of the phrase. But the idiom really means I'm so busy. I'm extremely busy, or as she put it, I'm so busy even a cat can help me. So it has to do with busyness, and it mentions a cat's hands. I don't think a speaker of English would ever have thought of that way of coming up with an idiom for being busy. The second one she mentioned, it literally means I have a cat's tongue. And what it really means idiomatically is I can't eat or drink hot things. It reminds me of the English expression, you eat like a bird, which is a certain kind of eating based, being compared to another animal. But I guess cats are known for not wanting to eat or drink hot things. So you say, I have a cat's tongue, meaning that you need to wait for your tea or whatever to become lukewarm before you can enjoy it. And the third one she gave me is, it literally means gold coins cast before cats. What could this mean? That's the literal meaning of it. But the phrase really refers to something precious or valuable that's been wasted on someone who can't appreciate it. And Hiroko had looked this up in a book, and she found that the English equivalent was supposed to be pearls cast before swine. I've heard that expression before, and I never knew what it meant. So there are even some idioms in English that I don't really understand very well. I didn't really know what that meant. I had to ask her to explain it to me. But gold coins cast before cats. I guess gold coins are very precious, and cats just wouldn't even appreciate them. So that's how that expression came about, I suppose. So thanks for the examples, Hiroko. Now, let's try to look at some examples in Indian languages. And I promise to tell you why I don't have a lot of these examples. I have a few, but... and I kind of have mentioned this already, that only the really fluent speakers of a language are really in command of a lot of idioms. So often, even a good language student, relatively good language student who can converse quite well in a language, doesn't know that many idioms. They tend to speak more literally. Sometimes it's because they're translating from their own language. Sometimes it's because they just haven't had specific lessons in idioms. I think it's good in language class every now and then to spend some time specifically with idioms. We used to do that in Spanish and French class, I know. And it's something that I think is often overlooked in Indian language classes, and that's why I thought this show was worth doing, to put people on the alert for looking for idioms in their own language. Now, I have a couple of examples here from Caddo. One is Haime Kiwat, which means big home, and it's an expression that's used to refer to heaven. And there are hymns that mention this phrase, I'm going to big home, and what they mean is that it's singing about going to heaven. But you couldn't necessarily predict that entirely from the meaning of the words within the phrase. There's another one, I meant to look this up, I'm sorry I don't have the example in the Caddo example, but the literal meaning of the phrase is, I killed it. And this was a phrase that came up in one of our Caddo classes once out in Gracemont. We were trying to figure out how you could play bingo in Caddo and what you might call the game or what you would call out when you had bingo. And they came up with this expression, I'm sorry I can't quote it, but it's a way of saying I won, but it literally means I killed it. And that's how you say I won in other contexts as well. So we decided to use that for the bingo game and to call the game by that name. And a third example from Caddo, Sinasa anta, do you have any? Which is a kind of a greeting where it sort of means how are you, but you're literally saying do you have any? And the traditional answer, the person that was greeted says back, kubangta, I don't have any. And I imagine this might be something like saying what's new, nothing. In other words, do you have any news? No, I don't have any. I'm not sure if that's what really goes through the Caddo speaker's mind or not, but this is some kind of idiom that's used as a greeting and response. Now I have a couple of examples from Comanche. The first one is one that we learned in beginning Comanche class, and our teacher, Lucille McCong, just couldn't help giggling every time she heard a student say it. I think because it's so idiomatic, she's not used to hearing a non-native speaker of the language use an expression like this. And it says, and you have to have a certain attitude when you say it too, you say, nanake. Now the literal meaning is, I'm just not, which doesn't seem to mean much. It leaves a lot to the imagination, I guess. But the idiomatic meaning is, I'm not up to par, I'm not feeling so well, I've had it almost, maybe not quite that strong. I'm not up to par was her favorite translation for that phrase. Here's another one, and this is kind of a euphemism, but I would also call it an idiom, ky naha. It means literally no longer with us, and it's the way you can refer to someone who has recently passed away, to use another idiom, who has recently died. So no longer with us. I mean, someone could be, let's face it, someone could have passed away and still be there in the casket right there with us, but you would still say they're no longer with us if you refer to the fact that they've passed away. So it is idiomatic and not literal. And another one from Comanche is the word for pie. It's na'anokop, which literally means pregnant bread. Now, it helps to know that there's a whole series of expressions based on the word na'kop, which is baked things, or most generically bread. You can say na'kop for bread, or you can say pina na'kop, sugar na'kop, and that means cake, typically. Or is it cookie? Cake, I believe. Or you can say na'anokop, pregnant baked thing, pregnant bread, and that's pie. I think the idea is that it kind of sticks out like this, and it's got something inside. I think that's a very colorful and amusing idiom from Comanche. Now, just today I was calling up Laura Anderson. I want to thank her for these following examples from Cherokee. She's a Cherokee instructor, has been for some time at OU. She gave me 4 examples. I'll try to get through these. I'll try to pronounce the Cherokee. It's not going to be very good, so please forgive me. I'm not even a Cherokee student in any serious sense, but I wrote this out sort of phonetically. I'll try my best. Walosi udikala insdas. The literal meaning is frog, and the next word, udikala, means something like either it scatters or urinate. It's an odd 2 possibilities for a meaning, but frog plus it scatters or urinate, and the last word, insdas, means something. It's kind of a happen word. It means something like happen. It's often used when you've stuck 2 verbs together. Anyway, it's hard to figure out what this means if you just take each word on its own and try to add it up and figure out what the phrase means. But what it means is a wart. So it's not a saying, as many idioms are, but it's a description of something that's kind of non-literal. You put it together in a funny way. It seems like you're saying a wart is a result of a frog peeing. I think it means something like that, but of course it doesn't mean it too literally. It's just an idiom that means a wart. The next one she gave me is sawa yuwakt. I hope I'm pronouncing that more or less correctly. The first word means one, and the next word means it's a conditional, if one looks back, something like that. And it's the expression that's used to start a lot of stories. It's something like once upon a time. But literally one, if one looks back. So it's an idiom as well. Naya ditadana. The first word, naya, means rock or sand, and the second word means them you will cause, or them you will make. Altogether, this phrase means bricks. So there's some relation between sand or rock, I guess, because bricks may have this in them. But I think it's fair to say that it's an idiom. And the last one is Cedar Nellie. This is a one-word idiom again, I think. The C part means one unit, and there's a root in there, nel, which means they all live. And the whole thing is a word for family, and it means they all live together. But I asked her carefully about this, and she said, it really doesn't just mean where they all live together, or a unit that lives together. It really means family. It has a kind of a non-literal meaning. It's close to the literal meaning, but it really is the word for family. And if you live together, you don't call yourselves Cedar Nellie unless you are a family, as well as living together. Now I've got one example from Plains Sign Language. This is the sign language of Comanches and Kiowas and other Indians in the Plains area. And it goes something like this. You pull your arm across your waist. Are we seeing this? Yes. My friend Albert Naquati, you kind of use this expression in English, an equivalent of it. He said, oh, I'm about cut in two. And what he meant is I'm really, really hungry, or I'm starving. And I think it's based on this sign language image. It obviously is not literally cut in two. I think it reminds me of the English expression, I've got a pit in my stomach, and that pit's so deep it goes all the way through the back, and I'm about cut in half. I think that's kind of the image we get. I've got one example from Ponca that has two varieties. The word for cow, I've heard different versions from different people. I've been told on the one hand that Teska, which is literally white buffalo, means cow. Someone else just recently told me, no, you really should say Indeska, which means white face. In either case, there's the literal meaning of the phrase, and there's the actual meaning of this idiom, which is cow. I've got one from Kiowa, and they're telling me we got to quit. In Kiowa, you say Zedelbe, and it means something like, literally fierce, but you use it to congratulate someone. It's almost like saying, you bad, when somebody's done something really good, I think. Zedelbe, good for you, that kind of idiomatic meaning. So idioms are interesting, often colorful, unpredictable. They're something that are only known by the really good speakers of a language. The better speaker you are, the more you know. The better you want to be, the more you better learn. So learn to recognize and collect idioms, those unpredictable, quirky combinations of meanings that have unpredictable usages. And I'll see you next time on Wordpath.
Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita, wa pene manaone kita. Na hene yo hene, na hene yo hene, ana magwana kita,